Oxygen Transport by Connor Baylog.
Gabby Caltabiano.
Anthony Cresci.
Featuring
Peter
Konakowski! Yay!
Hey Tony, how does the brain control breathing?
Well, Peter, respiration is controlled by the respiratory neural centers in the brain, the medulla oblongata and pons. The pons is located just superiorly to the medulla oblongata along the brainstem. Medullary respiratory controls include ventral respiratory group, or VRG, which extends from the ventral brainstem to the pons medullary junction. This controls apnea, or the rhythmic breathing of the body. Phrenic and intercostal nerves innervate the diaphragm and intercostal muscles respectively. When inspiratory action potentials fire, thoracic capacity increases and air comes into the lung. When expiratory action potentials fire, the muscles relax, thoracic capacity decreases, and air moves out of the lung. The second group is the dorsal respiratory group, which is located on root cranial nerve 9. Peripheral stretch receptors and chemoreceptors influence the medullary respiratory control's action potentials. The second group is the pons, which modifies medullary nerves by increasing inspiration or expiration to changes in stimuli. And that is how the brain controls the respiratory center.
Alright, well that's cool and all, but how does air get into the body?
Well, Peter, I'll be talking about the gross anatomy of the respiratory system. It begins with the nose, which is the only external organ, and is the airway for respiration. Next we have the paranasal sinuses, which are located in the nose, and it helps warm and moisten the air. We then go to the larynx, which is the voice box, and it provides an open airway, and it also helps route air and food into the proper channels. We then go to the trachea, which is the windpipe. It cleans, warms, and moistens the air as well. The trachea divides into the right and left bronchi. The right bronchi is wider, shorter, and more vertical. The main bronchi divides into the lobar bronchi, which supplies O2 to each lung. It then goes into the segmental bronchi, which goes into smaller bronchioles. The bronchioles lead into the alveolar ducts, which lead into alveolar sacs and saccules. The alveoli provide the surface area we need for oxygen exchange. The alveolar pores allow air pressure in the lungs to be equalized. And that's...
Thanks, Gabby, that was the bee's knees. But hey, Connor, how does oxygen get to the blood?
It's funny you asked that, Pete, because as of right now, I'm going to break down very simply the pulmonary and systemic circulation to you in a nice, fine manner. To begin, we're going to start with the main purpose of the red blood cells. The main purpose of the whole circulatory system is to bring the blood closer to contact with the alveolar sacs, which are further known as air sacs. So let's break it down even smaller in little tiny microscopic areas. As you can see here, the blood is going to be brought in the pulmonary circulation in the pulmonary capillaries, which brings the blood really close to the outside of the alveolar sacs in the pulmonary capillaries. At this point, the red blood cell is going to sit adjacent to this very thin membrane, which sits the only membrane that holds the blood to the air sacs. At this point, it makes it extremely easy for the CO2 to be released from the red blood cell and diffuse across the membrane into the air sac. At the same time, that fresh air that was just brought in is going to come diffuse back across the membrane into the blood plasma. At this point, it's going to float for a very short time and come in to the red blood cell, which will attach at 4 points. Each red blood cell can hold up to 4 oxygen atoms because it has 4 iron groups which hold the oxygen atom on its heme group. Red blood cells are an immaculate cell, which have been made through evolution to be the perfect 100% awesome cell to carry oxygen and CO2 transport. Through evolution, they have grown to have no organelles whatsoever, which makes the most ability to hold as much oxygen and CO2 at the same, to be able to transport it. If they do need a little bit of oxygen, they're not going to get to use the oxygen that they carry because that would defeat the purpose of them transporting it. Instead, they will undergo a process called anaerobic respiration, which I will get into at a later time. So, as we say, the red blood cell now has picked up its O2 from the pulmonary capillaries. From this point, it will travel down into what are called small little tunnels called venules. From here, it will go up that little windy road into pulmonary veins, and then transfer into the left atrium.
Wow, gee whiz, Connor, that sure is interesting, but how does oxygen get to the tissue?
Well, Pete, I'm glad you asked, because now I'm going to explain where it goes after this. We left off, Pete, where it ended right into the left atrium. At this point, the heart is going to perform systole, where it will push all the blood through the left atrium down into the left ventricle, which will then perform a systole once again, and push all that blood starting in the apex and working its way up, that oxygenated blood out into the aorta, which is an elastic artery, as we know. From here, that oxygenated blood will travel through the body, through the muscular arteries, then into smaller areas as it splits up into finger-like areas, into the arterioles, and then finally into specific capillaries along the tissue beds which need more O2. At this point, the red blood cell will lie adjacent to the membrane of the tissue, which is now going to undergo internal respiration. As before, which we had stated in the previous part, was external respiration from the outside of the alveolar sacs to the blood. Here, we are looking at the tissue adjacent to the red blood cells, down inside the body. So, the red blood cell will release its O2 that it picked up in the alveolar sacs, and it will diffuse across the membrane into the tissues, which can be used for ATP synthase. But at the same time, ATP synthase also has a byproduct, which one of them is CO2, which will then be released from the tissue space and diffuse through the membrane into the plasma where it will be picked up by the red blood cell. Most of the CO2 will be sucked up into the red blood cell and transformed into CO2 bicarbonate, which will then, about 70% or so, will then travel in this manner through the blood plasma, through the capillaries, back to the venules, and then keep on going until it reaches the veins. At this point, it will then come down to where it goes back to the heart center, the heart organ. At this point, it will go into the right ventricle, the right atrium. At this point, Pete, it will then be systoled down through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. At this point, the heart will then push that now deoxygenated blood out of the heart, and then it will go through the pulmonary trunk, and it will go down to the pulmonary arterioles, then into the specific capillaries, where the whole system and cycle can start once again. Oxygen transport.